She walked into a blind date with only $5 in her purse, certain that the man she trusted would carry the evening. Instead, he turned her secret into a cruel spectacle. Diners laughed whispers cut like knives, and the manager ordered her to leave. Humiliation burned hotter than hunger, and $5 felt smaller than dust. She reached for her bag, ready to vanish, when a chair scraped the floor. A figure rose. The man she never wanted to see in that moment, her employer, stood watching. But Harlan West was not just an employer. He was the undercover boss, and what he chose to do next silenced the entire restaurant. In the space between ridicule and respect, Amara's life shifted forever. Amara opened her purse, and the emptiness stared back at her. A single bill, soft with wear, folded so many times it had nearly torn at the edges. $5. She pressed her fingers against it as though clutching it tighter would stretch its worth. That morning she had wired most of her wages to her mother in the village, money meant to cover medicine and a leaking roof. She saw her mother's frail hands through memory, grateful yet worried that her daughter had kept nothing for herself. Another image pierced through her younger brother, clutching a battered notebook with joy as he paid his school fee. His smile had been bright, but the knowledge that his sister had sacrificed again left a shadow across it. Amara bore their burdens quietly, a girl in her 20s carrying weight meant for shoulders older and stronger. Yet she never complained. She never allowed herself the luxury of self-pity. Now that lone bill sat between her and hunger, between her and dignity. In the polished glow of the restaurant, it felt like an insult, a secret waiting to be exposed. She closed her purse quickly, as though hiding her poverty could also hide her truth. But the truth never stayed hidden for long. The memory cut deeper when she thought of her job. Only days earlier she had been summoned to the office where the supervisor barely looked up from his screen. His words were clipped, impersonal. "Your overtime hours are canceled. Effective immediately. No reason given, no explanation offered." Amara stood in silence, heart-pounding, while the man turned back to his computer as though she no longer existed. Outside, whispers followed her down the hallway. "She's just the help," someone muttered. "Easier to cut the ones no one notices." Their voices stung more than the loss of income, because each word confirmed what the world believed: she was worth nothing more than a replaceable hand. Amara lowered her head, refusing to meet their eyes. Pride kept her back straight, but inside she felt smaller with every step. That overtime money had been her lifeline, the extra she counted on for bus fare and groceries. Without it, the gap between survival and collapse widened. She carried the news home silently, unwilling to let her mother hear the tremor in her voice. Poverty had always shadowed her, but this was humiliation layered on top of hardship. And yet she swallowed it because that was what she had always done. One evening, while ironing a client's jacket, something heavy slipped against her palm. She reached into the pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope. The flap opened under her fingers to reveal stacks of bills, crisp and undeniable. $3,000. Her breath caught heart hammering in her chest. The room fell silent around her as she stared at the weight of temptation. No one had seen her find it. No one would know if she tucked it away. For a moment, her imagination betrayed her: rent covered for months, her brother's tuition secured, food without rationing, medicine without hesitation. The possibilities rose like a tide, swelling higher, then breaking against the one truth she had always lived by. Integrity was worth more than survival. With steady hands, she smoothed the envelope, placed it back on her employer's desk, and walked away without leaving a note. She said nothing, wanted no recognition. It was simply the right thing to do. Later that night, she lay awake, stomach hollow, but her conscience unburdened. The world could strip her of shifts of wages of pride, but it could not strip her of honesty. And that was the only treasure she had ever been unwilling to lose. The phone buzzed in Amara's pocket as she walked home from work, the city fading into dusk. She answered quickly, hearing her mother's frail voice from miles away. "The money arrived, my child." "Thank you. We can finally buy the medicine." Relief coated her words, but exhaustion cracked through. Amara bit her lip, forcing a smile even though no one could see it. She whispered back, "Don't worry, Mama, I'm fine." Before she could hang up, another voice joined the line, her little brother, cheerful but uncertain. "Sister, do you still have enough for yourself?" The question pierced her deeper than hunger ever could. She laughed softly, hiding the sting in her throat. "Yes. Don't worry about me. I'm fine. The lie fell heavy because all she had left was a single worn bill folded in her purse. Yet she would rather starve quietly than let them carry her burden. As she slipped the phone back into her bag, tears pressed against her lashes, but she blinked them away. Sacrifice was the language she had learned young, and it was the only one she spoke fluently. Tonight would be no different. Across town, another story unfolded. Harlan West, the billionaire CEO of one of the largest hotel chains in the country, adjusted the crooked line of his old shirt collar. His usual tailored suits had been left behind. Tonight, his disguise was deliberate. A wrinkled shirt, thick glasses, and a worn jacket stripped him of recognition. For weeks, he had lived this double-life part of an undercover program designed to test his company from within. He washed linens, hauled luggage, cleaned kitchens, each task giving him a view of how the unseen were treated. Yet beneath the disguise beat the heart of a man with authority to change everything. Few would ever suspect the weary-looking employee was in fact the one who signed their paychecks. And fewer still knew the deeper twist one of those employees he now sought to observe was Amara. Their lives had already crossed in silence when she placed $3,000 back on his desk untouched. What remained hidden was how soon that silent honesty would resurface in the most public way imaginable. That evening, Harlan sat quietly in the corner of a crowded restaurant, his disguise blending him into the background. He studied the room with calm detachment until his eyes landed on a familiar figure. Amara, in her modest blue dress, sat at a table set for two. Her posture was tense, her hands twisting nervously near two empty glasses. Recognition struck him like a wave. He remembered the envelope of cash placed neatly on his desk untouched and unclaimed a silent act of integrity that had lingered in his mind. Now, here she was, waiting for someone shrinking under the weight of invisible judgment. Harlan leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. He had come undercover to witness how employees were treated. Instead, fate had placed before him the very woman whose honesty had once startled him. The scene unfolding carried the smell of cruelty, and he could not look away. The manager's eyes slid over Amara with open disdain as though her presence alone cheapened the polished floor beneath her chair. Conversations from nearby tables lowered into hushed murmurs, some curious, others openly mocking. Amara gripped her phone as if it were an anchor, her thumb brushing across the dark screen, waiting for a message that never came. Each second stretched longer, amplifying her isolation. She shifted in her seat, willing herself invisible, but the scrutiny of strangers pressed heavier than the silence. From the corner, Harlan saw it all. Behind his glasses, his gaze was steady, his jaw tight. Every wordless sneer, every dismissive glance landed on him like stones. Yet he remained still, reminding himself why he had come undercover to watch, to learn to see the truth unfiltered. But the thought gnawed at him, how long could he justify silence while someone under his care was humiliated in plain view? The tension coiled inside him, a spring wound tighter with each passing heartbeat, waiting for the inevitable snap. At last, the door opened and Evan strolled in late and unbothered. His jacket gleamed under the light, shoes, polished hair slicked to perfection. Without a glance toward Amara, he dropped into his chair as though the evening owed him its service. He waved lazily at a server ordering a drink for himself without asking if she wanted one. Amara forced a thin smile, her voice barely steady. "You're here." Evan smirked, leaning back with ease. "Don't get the wrong idea. This isn't serious. Just killing time." The words landed like blows, stripping away what little dignity she had hoped the night would offer. Her smile cracked the effort of composure draining from her face. Around them, a couple shifted uncomfortably, sensing cruelty in the casual dismissal. Evan carried on as if her feelings were a performance he'd grown tired of, while Amara sat across from him, small and wounded, her hope collapsing under his arrogance. From the corner, Harlan studied every word, every gesture, his mind recording it all with clinical precision and personal anger. He watched Amara's shoulders curl inward, her face lowered to the tablecloth as her fingers trembled around her glass. The sound of Evan's dismissive tone grated against his patience, each insult striking chords of fury he worked to contain. His instincts screamed to intervene, to shut down the cruelty in front of him, but discipline chained him to his seat. This was supposed to be observation, nothing more. Yet the sight of integrity being trampled by arrogance felt unbearable. His hands clenched beneath the table knuckles, whitening. Rage simmered in silence, an ember waiting for air. He told himself he could wait, that he must wait. But with every passing second it felt less like restraint and more like betrayal. He knew the moment of eruption was coming and nothing would hold it back for long. The waiter returned with a polite smile, tray tucked under one arm, but his voice carried the weight of policy. Before we proceed, may I have a card on file?" The request sliced through Amara's fragile composure. She straightened, her lips trembling. "My guest will handle it," she murmured, glancing at Evan with a desperate flicker of hope. Evan leaned back, lips curling into a smirk, and gestured toward her. "Ladies first." The words landed like a trap disguised as courtesy. Heat climbed Amara's neck as every pair of eyes seemed to turn toward her. She could feel the room listening, waiting. Her chest tightened, the air thick as though dignity itself was demanding proof she could not provide. Evan's gaze lingered on her, relishing the corner he had forced her into. Amara's pulse thundered, hands clammy against the leather strap of her purse. She knew the truth. There was no card, no safety net. All that separated her from complete exposure was the wrinkled bill hidden away, a secret about to be torn into the open. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp of her purse, the silence of the room pressing down as though every breath belonged to her alone. Slowly, she drew out the single bill, creased, fragile, barely recognizable as currency, and laid it on the polished table. Her eyes dropped, refusing to see the expressions around her. Evan's laughter exploded across the room, sharp and cruel, filling the air with ridicule. The sound carried beyond their table, inviting others to join in. A few diners stifled chuckles, while others shook their heads, uncomfortable but unwilling to interfere. Amara's shoulders curled inward, the weight of humiliation crushing her frame. The waiter shifted uneasily, caught between duty and pity, unsure whether to pick up the bill or walk away. That piece of paper, once meant for bus fare and emergencies, had become her undoing. A life of sacrifice reduced in an instant to a joke worth $5. In that moment, Amara felt smaller than she had ever been, as though dignity could be measured and dismissed by the value of a single note. Evan snatched the bill from the table and held it up between two fingers, waving it like a party trick. $5, he sneered, voice rising. "Think this covers bread, maybe a stale crust." His mockery rippled outward, infecting the room with second-hand shame. Amara's throat constricted, her words caught like glass shards she couldn't swallow. She stared at her lap, eyes burning, wishing the floor would open and take her away. A couple nearby exchanged uneasy glances, one shaking his head in silent disapproval. But no one spoke. No one stopped the cruelty. Evan leaned forward, delighting in his performance, every word sharpened to wound. At the corner, Harlan's fists clenched beneath the table, the knuckles blanching. The disguise hid his identity, but it could not mask his anger. He sat motionless, forcing himself to watch, to witness, though every fiber demanded action. Evan laughed again, louder this time, transforming Amara into a spectacle for strangers. For him it was entertainment, for her it was erasure. Evan leaned back, lips curling into a cruel smile. "What are you, anyway? A maid?" The word fell heavy, striking harder than laughter, harder than his sneer. It was not a question, but a verdict, stripping her of every layer she had tried to wear that night. Amara bit down on her lip, tasting metal, fighting the tears that threatened to betray her. Around them, the quiet shifted into murmurs, the kind of whispers that cut deeper because they were shared. Eyes flicked toward her, curious, judgmental, some even entertained. The waiter took a step closer, face drawn with sympathy, but the manager's sharp glance froze him in place. Amara sat frozen, trapped between humiliation and silence, knowing any denial would only prove the word more true. The label clung to her like a brand, exposing what she had always hidden. And in that instant, the room became a court, Evan its judge and she its unwilling defendant. The manager approached with the authority of rules that cared little for dignity. His tone was clipped, final. "Without a card, we'll have to ask you to leave the table." Amara's throat tightened as she tried to form words. I'll go," she stammered, each syllable heavy with surrender. Evan chuckled, shaking his head with mock pity. "See, can't even meet the minimum standard." His voice carried in the still air, and the room responded with silence so sharp it stung. Every diner seemed suspended in the tension, waiting to see how far the cruelty would reach. From his corner, Harlan lowered his gaze, but the fire behind his glasses burned hot. His hands stayed folded, but his thoughts thundered. Here was his employee, his responsibility being cast out not for wrongdoing, but for poverty. The injustice pressed against him like a weight he could barely contain, and he knew his silence was breaking. Amara rose slowly, clutching her small bag to her chest as if it were armor against the eyes boring into her. Her steps were unsteady, each one dragging like a sentence. Her shoulders trembled, shrinking with every movement toward the exit. Around her, whispers swelled faint but sharp enough to sting. Some carried pity, others judgment, all of them pressing her deeper into shame. Evan leaned back in satisfaction, arms crossed, watching her departure like the closing act of a play he had written. His eyes gleamed with the pleasure of victory as though he had proven something by crushing someone weaker. Amara's face burned, the humiliation covering her features like a mask she could not remove. She held her head low, praying the ground might swallow her whole. To everyone else, she looked small, defeated. To herself, she felt erased, every sacrifice reduced to nothing under the weight of one public disgrace. The scrape of wood against tile cut sharply through the silence, jarring every conversation into stillness. Heads turned in unison, eyes searching for the source of the sound. At the far corner, a man rose from his chair, calm yet commanding. Harlan West stood tall, his movements unhurried, his presence undeniable despite the plain clothes that cloaked him. The old shirt, the worn jacket, the unremarkable glasses, none of it could disguise the quiet authority that radiated as he straightened. Under the lights, even his modest attire seemed touched with gravity, every fold of fabric drawing attention rather than deflecting it. Conversations died mid-sentence. The waiter froze in place. Evan's smug grin faltered for a fraction of a second before returning brittle and sharp. Amara, still clutching her purse, halted mid-step, her breath catching as if time itself had paused. The room thickened with anticipation, every diner leaning inward, waiting for the stranger to speak, knowing instinctively that something in the air had shifted forever. Harlan's voice rang low but steady, each word carrying across the room like a verdict. "That will not be necessary." The sentence stopped Amara where she stood. She turned, eyes wide, disbelief written across her face. The manager stiffened, uncertainty flickering as his authority wavered. Evan laughed harshly, leaning forward with contempt. "And who are you supposed to be, playing the hero?" The challenge rang loud, but the room did not echo his bravado. Instead, silence swelled heavy electric. Forks rested untouched on plates. Diners held their breath as if the outcome of this exchange mattered to them all. Amara's knees weakened, her mind racing between relief and dread. She had never wanted anyone to see her shame, least of all him. Yet there he was, standing unflinching, and his words had already begun to tilt the balance. The stillness that followed felt sharper than any laughter before it, a collective heartbeat suspended on what he might say next. Amara's lips parted, a whisper escaping without permission. "Mr. West." The sound barely carried, yet the recognition rippled outward like a spark. Harlan inclined his head slightly, his gaze fixed on her, steady, unwavering. The revelation stirred the room into murmurs. Diners exchanged looks of shock, realization dawning that the quiet man who had risen was no ordinary guest. Evan narrowed his eyes, his confidence sharpening into mockery. "So, this is your boss? Makes sense. Even more pathetic." His laugh was hollow, strained. Amara's throat constricted. She wanted to deny, to hide, but her voice betrayed her, falling silent. The truth had slipped free, and there was no way to call it back. Around them, the atmosphere shifted from curiosity to awe, as though the walls themselves knew the weight of this disclosure. Harlan's disguise had cracked, and with it came a new tension. This was no longer a private humiliation, but a test of power, integrity, and what dignity truly meant. Harlan stepped forward, his movements deliberate, and placed a steady hand on Amara's trembling shoulder. She flinched at the touch, then froze as his voice rose above the hush of the room. "She is not just a maid," he declared, each word carrying the weight of truth. "She is my guest." The sentence hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. The manager faltered, eyes darting from Harlan to Amara, his authority draining into unease. Evan burst into laughter, but the sound cracked at the edges, a brittle disguise for fear. His smirk twisted, unconvincing, even to himself. Amara's lips parted, her breath catching as tears spilled down her cheeks. She shook her head, slightly unable to reconcile her shame with the dignity suddenly handed back to her. The atmosphere shifted, the power in the room tilting. For the first time that night, Amara was no longer the spectacle. Evan was. And in that reversal, the balance of humiliation and respect began to transform before every watching eye. The manager stammered, his voice thin. "Sir, the policy requires—" He was cut short as Harlan reached into his pocket and pulled out a black card, placing it firmly on the table with a controlled thud. "Set whatever hold you need," he said, his tone cold as steel. "But before anything else, you will apologize to her." The card gleamed under the lights, a symbol of power that silenced every murmur. The manager's face flushed crimson as he bowed, low words stumbling from his lips. "Miss I apologize." The act, small yet public, sent a ripple through the crowd. Diners exhaled as though they had been holding their breath, astonished at the sudden turn. Evan's laughter died in his throat, replaced by a tight sneer. In that moment, the rules of the restaurant, the sneers of strangers, even Evan's arrogance, all collapsed under the quiet authority of the man who had chosen to stand. Amara shook her head quickly, voice trembling. "It's fine. Please, it doesn't matter." But Harlan cut through her words with a sharp finality. "No, it is never fine." His voice deepened, reaching every corner of the room. "No one must ever apologize for being humiliated. The ones who humiliate are the ones who must bow." A hush settled again, this time heavy with agreement. A diner nodded slowly, another whispered, "He's right." The murmurs grew not in ridicule but in support, the tide of the room shifting in her favor. Amara pressed her lips together, tears blurring her sight, unable to process the solidarity surrounding her. Evan leaned back, face sour, pushing his chair as if distance could shield him from the rebuke. Harlan's words lingered in the air, carving themselves into memory. They were not spoken only for Amara, but for every person watching, each reminded of what dignity truly meant. Evan's laugh sliced through the room, brittle but loud. "You think she belongs here? She walked in with $5, for God's sake." He leaned back, arms folded, daring the room to agree with him. Harlan shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing, the steel in his gaze impossible to ignore. He spoke with calm precision, each word sharpened like a blade. "You want to talk about money? Then let us talk about integrity." The room stilled, forks, lowered whispers cut short. Every diner felt the shift, the weight of something far larger than a petty insult. Amara lifted her head, lips trembling, her breath shallow but steady. The sound of her employer's defense struck her deeper than the humiliation that had preceded it. In that silence, the air pressed heavier, as though the entire restaurant held its breath. Evan's smirk faltered for the briefest instant, rattled by the man who refused to match his volume, but crushed him with truth instead. Harlan's voice cut clean through the air. "Yesterday she found $3,000 in my jacket. No witnesses, no record. No one would have known if she had taken it. And do you know what she did?" His gaze never left Evan, but his words were for everyone. The room leaned closer, pulled into the revelation. She placed it quietly on my desk and walked away. Gasps rippled, chairs shifted, and conversations hushed into reverent silence. Evan blinked, the confidence draining from his face. He forced a crooked smile, but it carried no weight. Diners exchanged looks of astonishment, their expressions shifting from pity to admiration. Amara pressed her hand to her mouth, tears spilling despite her attempt to hold them back. Her secret act of integrity, once invisible, now stood exposed under the glow of judgment and respect. The power of Harlan's testimony filled the room, not as defense, but as undeniable truth. And in that moment, Amara's worth rose higher than every sneer that had been cast against her. Evan snapped back, desperate to recover ground. She staged it. "Don't you see? She's playing you?" His words rang false, the panic undercutting his sneer. Harlan's expression hardened, his voice colder now. "And what about you? Playing with people's dignity? Recording their humiliation for sport?" A murmur surged through the diners as all eyes dropped to Evan's phone resting on the table, its red light blinking like an exposed wound. Evan's face drained of color, his bravado slipping into unease. He snatched the device, fumbling to cover it with his hand, but the evidence was undeniable. The silence thickened, every breath held taut, as if the walls themselves recoiled at what was uncovered. Evan shifted in his seat, anger flashing but fear stronger. In that instant, the humiliation he had orchestrated reversed, the crowd no longer entertained, but repulsed. And the man who had mocked $5 now stood exposed as cheap in ways no wealth could disguise. Harlan's tone dropped sharp as a blade. "Delete it. Right here. Now." The command carried no room for negotiation. Evan stuttered words, tumbling without force. I was only." But the sound of movement behind him cut him short. Two security staff stood with arms crossed, presence alone enough to press him into panic. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his fingers fumbling across the screen. The red light blinked stubbornly as the file loaded proof of his cruelty laid bare for all to see. The silence of the room pressed closer, filled only by the faint taps of his shaking hands. Whispers rose from the tables, low, condemning. "Serves him right," one voice muttered. Another, sharper. "Disgusting." The verdict of strangers wrapped around him harsher than any policy. At last, the recording vanished, his face flushed with humiliation. The laughter he had once wielded now turned against him, echoing in the contempt of the crowd. Evan shoved the phone into his pocket and kicked his chair back, the legs screeching against the floor. His face burned crimson fury, twisting into desperation. "Keep her," he shouted, voice cracking. "Feed on the trash if you want. She's all yours." His words spat like venom, but they rang hollow. The diners watched without flinching, their expressions no longer amused but condemning. Evan stormed toward the exit, his shoulders rigid, fists clenched. The door slammed behind him, rattling the glass and leaving an ugly echo in his wake. For a moment, the room stood still, as though the tension itself needed time to dissolve. Then, almost as one, people exhaled. A weight lifted from the air, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. The spectacle had ended, not with his victory, but with his retreat, his arrogance shattered into disgrace. The predator had become the fool, and everyone knew it. Harlan turned back to Amara, his presence softening as though a storm had passed. "Sit down," he said, the command gentle, not forceful. Amara hesitated, her voice barely audible. "Everyone." "They're still watching." Harlan shook his head, eyes steady. "They are not watching your humiliation anymore. They are watching respect." The words wrapped around her like a shield, lifting the shame that had crushed her moments before. The diners remained silent, their gazes fixed, but no longer with ridicule. Something in the air had shifted. Pity had become recognition. Derision had become quiet admiration. Amara's chest heaved as she lowered herself back into her seat, tears glistening but mingled now with the faint curve of a smile. The room held the weight of transformation. The same eyes that had condemned her now bore witness to her dignity restored. And for the first time that evening she felt seen, not as a maid, not as a burden, but as a human being worthy of respect. Harlan's gaze did not leave her as he spoke, steady and unyielding. "Yes, I did. Because you gave me honesty when no one was watching. Tonight, I give you respect when everyone is." The words struck deeper than any insult could have, cutting through the shame that had clung to her. Amara's fork slipped from her hand as tears streamed freely, but these tears carried no humiliation. They were born of release of a burden lifted. She cried, and with each tear the night's weight seemed to dissolve. Around them, a ripple moved through the crowd. A diner clapped softly, another followed, until scattered applause spread across the room. Heads nodded, not in pity, but in agreement. The atmosphere shifted, completely transformed from spectacle to solidarity. What had begun as humiliation now bloomed into pride, not only for Amara, but for everyone who bore witness to the change. In that moment, she was no longer the girl with $5. She was the embodiment of integrity, standing tall. The next morning, Amara walked into the towering glass building wearing her plain uniform, her steps cautious. The events of the night before still lingered unreal in her mind, but nothing prepared her for what she saw in the boardroom. Harlan was there, seated at the head of the long table, dressed not in worn clothes but in the sharp suit that marked his true station. Her breath caught her body freezing mid-step. Whispers drifted around her colleagues, trading shocked glances, some murmuring in awe. The man who had stood in that restaurant defending her against mockery was not a stranger after all. He was the CEO, her employer. The revelation struck like thunder, the pieces falling into place. The envelope she had returned, the quiet authority he had carried even in disguise the moment he had spoken for her when she could not. Harlan lifted his gaze, his eyes softer now, and offered her a faint smile, a silent reassurance. "Don't be afraid." The truth was out, and her world would never look the same again. The meeting room chilled into silence as the head of HR read from her notes. Records show that Amara's overtime was cut without cause. The words were delivered flat, but the weight of them settled over the room. Harlan's gaze locked onto Lucia, the HR director, and his voice cut sharper than glass. "Restore it, effective immediately, and calculate the back pay, every hour." The command left no space for negotiation. The hum of air conditioning filled the gap where objections should have been. Lucia's hands trembled against her folder, a sheen of sweat forming on her brow. "Sir." "Yes, sir," she stammered, scribbling frantically. Around the table, managers exchanged uneasy glances, none daring to intervene. Amara sat frozen, her mind unable to bridge the distance between years of silent endurance and this sudden turn of justice. She had never heard anyone speak on her behalf with such authority. For her, it was almost too much to believe. For the others, it was a warning that injustice would not be tolerated. Harlan leaned forward, his tone calm but unyielding. And another thing. Enroll her in any management course she chooses. Accounting, hospitality, leadership, it doesn't matter. Tuition will be covered in full by the company. The statement landed like a stone dropped into still water ripples spreading fast. Lucia blinked, mouth opening and closing. Sir, that's never been done before. Harlan's gaze cut to her, icy and precise. Never before, he repeated, because no one has ever earned it. But Amara has. His words carried both rebuke and conviction, leaving no doubt. Amara's breath caught her throat tightening as fresh tears spilled over. She pressed her hand against her chest as though steadying a heart that could not contain the surge of hope. For years, she had accepted the ceiling above her life, low and suffocating. Now, in one moment, it was torn away. She was no longer bound by the role others had forced on her. Opportunity once unimaginable unfolded like a horizon before her eyes. Amara's voice broke the silence, fragile but determined. I'll repay every cent, I promise. I don't want. Harlan shook his head, cutting through her protest with a quiet finality. This is not debt. This is justice. You held on to honesty when no one was watching. Today, I return the dignity that should have been yours all along. The words dropped into the room, heavy with meaning. A hush followed, deeper than the corporate formality that usually ruled these walls. Even the managers, hardened by routine, shifted uneasily, struck by the weight of the truth. Amara's tears slid freely, her lips trembling, not with shame, but with gratitude. Around the table, silence thickened into reverence. The atmosphere carried no applause, no murmur, only the acknowledgement that something rare had unfolded. Integrity had been honored, not hidden. And for Amara, it was the first time her worth had been declared aloud, undeniable in front of those who once dismissed her. Harlan's voice softened, no longer edged with command, but layered with intent. One day, when the chance comes, pass this forward. Not for me, but for the world that needs it. His gaze held hers steady and unyielding until Amara nodded. Her hand trembled where it rested against the table, but her eyes glowed with something new resolve. The fear that had shadowed her face was gone, replaced by the flicker of belief. In that moment, she ceased to be only the maid whose sacrifices went unseen. She became a woman entrusted with responsibility, someone chosen not just to survive, but to lead. The office, the managers, the whispers of judgment all faded as his words carved themselves into her memory. She was no longer small. She was no longer invisible. The world might still test her, but she now carried more than restored dignity. She carried a mission, one that stretched beyond her own life. And that was freedom. Amara stepped through the revolving doors into the daylight, her tears catching in the sun. They glistened on her cheeks not as marks of shame, but as symbols of release. The air felt different, fresher, as though the world itself had shifted overnight. She clutched her small bag to her chest, no longer as armor, but as if it held the beginnings of a new life. A smile, hesitant but growing, curved across her lips. Her footsteps were lighter, each stride carrying her further away from the girl who had once shrunk beneath mocking eyes. Gone was the bent posture, the hesitant pace of someone trying to disappear. Now she moved forward, shoulders lifted, guided by dignity reclaimed. The memory of last night's humiliation lingered, but it had been transformed, rewritten into strength. And as the sun lit her face, she walked not as a servant to circumstance, but as someone stepping into her own horizon. By afternoon, whispers traveled through every corridor of the company. Did you hear? The cleaning girl. The CEO defended her. Stories grew in retelling each detail, sharpening the astonishment. Colleagues who once overlooked her now stared openly, their expressions altered. No longer was she invisible, no longer dismissed as background. Admiration flickered in their eyes, curiosity softened into respect. Amara's cheeks flushed under the attention, and she lowered her gaze, but a quiet smile betrayed her pride. Inside, she felt something anchor, deep a strength she had never carried before. She no longer feared their judgment. She no longer questioned her worth. The girl who had been mocked for $5 now walked among them with the weight of a truth greater than wealth. That character could command respect even where money could not. Every step through those hallways was a reminder her place had changed, and with it the way others would see her forever. Alone in his office, Harlan leaned back the night, replaying in his mind the bill crumpled on the table, the cruel laughter Amara's trembling hands. He exhaled slowly, his reflection staring back from the glass wall. Wealth had built the towers around him, but last night had reminded him of something greater. "It isn't wealth that makes us human," he murmured to himself. "It's how we treat those with less power than we hold." The thought settled firm, sharpening his resolve. His face, once tired from disguise, now shone with quiet determination. What he had witnessed was more than humiliation undone. It was proof that dignity once given space could silence even the loudest cruelty. And for him, that truth was no longer just a moment, it was a principle. A voice echoed like a truth carved into stone. To be poor in money is not a sin. To be poor in character, that is the tragedy. The words carried images behind them, Amara clutching her purse. Evan's mocking grin, fading Harlan's hand steady on her shoulder. Each scene burned into memory a gallery of what dignity and disgrace looked like side by side. The message did not fade with applause or wealth. It remained etched into those who heard it. Poverty of coin could be endured, survived even overcome. But poverty of honor left nothing to build on, nothing to respect. That was the line drawn across the night, and it would not be forgotten. If you stood in that restaurant and saw it unfold, would you stay silent, or would you rise? Leave your answer. Share your voice. And if this story moved you, subscribe for more reminders that dignity is priceless. Thank you for staying with us until the very end.